So tonight we're wrapping up the Advent Prophecy series and looking at our final one in Isaiah 9. So I'm just going to start by reading through the passage. So it's Isaiah 9 verses 1 to 7. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, as warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder. For as in the day of Midian's defeat, you have shattered the yoke that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor. Every warrior's boot used in battle and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. So I think there's sort of three sections that I want to focus on today. I mean, there's a huge amount of meaning and different aspects that we could look at from this passage. But yeah, there's three things that I want to sort of draw out tonight. And the first is sort of the significance of the where, right? So the very first verse or two talks about Galilee and Zebulun and Naphtali. And so I want to, have a little look at that. And then I also want to look at this question as to whether this passage is history or prophecy, right? And so I didn't realize before sort of researching to do this talk, but there's quite a lot of controversy and different interpretations of this passage. And some people would say that a lot of this refers to Hezekiah as history rather than being prophecy about Jesus. And so I want to sort of unpack that a little bit and then look at the parallels between Hezekiah and then more importantly about Jesus and what we learn about Jesus through the titles that are given to him in this passage. So the very first bit in verse 1, we read that in the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations. And so I've got a map here of the Israelite lands, and these are the Israelite tribes. And so you can see that Zebulun and Naphtali are up in the north of the kingdom by this lake, which later becomes known as the Sea of Galilee, and Jerusalem's down to the south in Judah. And if I switch over to a sort of a later map, you can see that really this whole region to the north is what then becomes known as Galilee. So you can see I've sort of got these red lines to show where the different places line up. I think this is significant really because of the Assyrian conquest, and I think Mark touched on this in his talk a couple of weeks back. But so this was about 700 years before Jesus was born, and we read this account in Kings where the king of Assyria came and took this list of towns that are up in this northern region, and he took Galilee and all the land of Naphtali, and he carried the people captive to Assyria. So the Assyrians have come in, they've invaded this land and like taken the native Jewish Israelites away. And then later in 2 Kings 17, we read that the king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuttah, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. So we can see this sort of exodus of the native Jews and like this bringing in of like foreigners and Gentiles, right? And that's really why in this passage we read that it's called, so this region of Zebulun and Naphtali in the future becomes Galilee of the nations, right? Or in another translation, it's Galilee of the Gentiles, because it was really seen as this area that was like, full of foreigners. And so by the time that Jesus was on the scene, sort of 700 years later, it really was this sort of big demographic split between the north in Galilee and the south with Judah and where Jerusalem was. And the people in the south were sort of like, the religious elite, right? Because Jerusalem, at least at this time in the Assyrian conquest, hadn't been conquered. So a lot of the like Pharisees and religious leaders would have been, in the south from Jerusalem, and they would have sort of looked down upon those who came from the north in Galilee. And there's loads of evidence of this in the Gospels themselves. So I've got a few verses I've picked out here. So there's an example where Jesus is calling the disciples. And then Philip goes and says, we found the one that Moses and the prophets wrote about. He's Jesus. He's the son of Joseph from Nazareth. And Nathaniel says, could anything good come from Nazareth, right? So that was the town in the north. There was this sort of disbelief that there could be something, so great coming from that region. When Peter denies Jesus after he's crucified, we read that people say, certainly this man Peter was also with him, for he too is a Galilean. And then in Matthew, which is the same episode but a different account of it, we read that people say to Peter, surely you're one of them because your accent gives them away, right? So people would have seen these Galileans and known them just by their accent. And then towards in Jesus' ministry, when he doesn't go to the festival of tabernacles in public, he goes in secret because he knows that the Pharisees are plotting to kill him. And Jesus' brothers tell him, leave Galilee and go to Judea so that your disciples there may see the works you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world, for even his own brothers did not believe him. So again, we're seeing this picture of you can't achieve good stuff up north in Galilee, right? You have to go down to the south in order to become this public figure and to become known to the world. And the Pharisees also dismissed Jesus for this reason. So we read Nicodemus is sort of defending Jesus's character, and the Pharisees reply to him, are you from Galilee too? Look into it, and you will find a prophet does not come out of Galilee. And so I was trying to sort of contextualize this into what would it look like today. And I think it's equivalent today of someone saying, can anything good come from the north? Go down to London, learn to speak without an accent, because a political leader can't come from Grimsby. And I don't say that to disparage Grimsby, but more to sort of draw attention to the fact that Nazareth was this small town in this sort of area that was looked down upon and deprived compared to the south of the land. And so I think this sort of goes some way to explain why there was so much distrust of Jesus, why sort of the Pharisees dismissed him so readily. But I think the fact that it's how we start this prophecy is just a way of showing that God is going to bring honor from this least likely of places, right? This is the sort of place that no one would expect the Savior and the Messiah to come from, and so that's why we sort of had this emphasis on the fact that God's going to honor this part of the country. So we've looked at the sort of significance of the where and a bit of the history of the Assyrian conquest, and so I want to sort of touch on this idea of whether the next bit of the passage is referring to the Assyrian conquest or whether it's referring to the future, right? And so I think especially in Jewish circles who want to sort of deny the fact that Jesus is the Messiah, they'd say that none of this is prophecy. Actually, it's all about Hezekiah and it's all about the history. So it's a good idea to probably have a look at who Hezekiah was. So he was one of the kings of Israel, and he was one of the good ones. So we read in 2 Kings 18 that Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before or after his time. He remained faithful to the Lord in everything. And then further on, we read this is like a message from the Assyrian king when he's conquering the northern lands, and he sends this message to King Hezekiah and says, don't let your God in whom you trust deceive you with promises that Jerusalem will not be captured by the king of Assyria. You know perfectly well what the kings of Assyria have done wherever they have gone. They have completely destroyed everyone who stood in their way. Why should you be any different? But we see that Hezekiah trusts in God. So we read that Isaiah that brings this message to Hezekiah. This is what the Lord says about the king of Assyria. His armies will not enter Jerusalem. They will not even shoot an arrow at it. And we see that Hezekiah then puts his trust in God. He prays to God, and we read that that night the angel of the Lord went out into the Assyrian camp and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. When the surviving Assyrians woke up the next morning, they found corpses everywhere. Then King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and returned to his own land. So we can see why people would say that this passage is about Hezekiah, right? So we've got this for as in the days of Midian's defeat, you've shattered the yoke of that burdens them, the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors. So there's all this imagery of war, right? And Midian's defeat is harkening back to another story in the Old Testament where God uses a really small group of Israelite soldiers to overcome a much greater army. And so it's similar to the way that the Assyrians were defeated effectively just through Hezekiah's faithfulness in God. And some people would then go on to say as well that these names or titles that are given also refer to Hezekiah. So this child that's born and the names Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Some people, yeah, say that they refer to Hezekiah rather than to Jesus. Um, but I think actually, like, what's happened here is that God set up this parallel for a reason, right? And this happens a lot in the Old Testament. So you've got like the story of Noah, where you see, this effect. God's it looks like God's going to reboot creation, that everything's going to go okay because of this one, great man Noah. But then, he gets off the ark and sins, and it all goes horribly wrong. Abraham looks like he's going to found this great nation, but then Israel, rebels against God, and so it all goes wrong. Moses is going to lead the people into the promised land, and he gets these 10 commandments from heaven, but almost immediately the Israelites disobey the commandments, and everything goes wrong. So I think really this picture of Hezekiah is like another one of these parallels, right, where we're seeing this sort of great man raised up effectively in history, and he's got like certain characteristics which like point towards Jesus, but he doesn't like fully embody them, right? Only Jesus fully embodies the characteristics and the names. So yeah, I want to go through each of the four names that we read, or four titles in this passage, and sort of compare how Hezekiah fulfills them to then how they're ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. So the first title is this idea of wonderful counselor, and so a counselor is someone that sort of brings advice and wisdom and encouragement to people, and we can see that Hezekiah lived up to this at least to some extent, right? So he was a king that sort of brought religious reform to Israel. So in 2 Kings 18, we read that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses has made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. So it was this picture of like idol worship, and the Israelites were all worshipping. They weren't worshipping God; they were worshipping all sorts of other things. And Hezekiah sort of, yeah, demolished all of that and brought in like strong counsel and strong wisdom, and like guided the nation into like, no, we should worship just the God and just the Lord of our ancestors. Um, he was also in the Assyrian war. We can see that he provided encouragement to people. So he in 2 Chronicles we read that he appointed military officers over people and assembled them before him in the city, in the square at the city gate, and encouraged them with these words: "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, because the king of Assyria and the vast army with him. For there is a greater power with us than with him." So you can see that he's encouraging people that no, our God is still with us, right? And it's through his faithfulness that Jerusalem is spared. And so yeah, you can see that he's sort of fulfilling these roles of counselor, right, bringing like advice and wisdom and encouragement to the people of Israel. But if we compare it to Jesus, right, Jesus is the one that goes on to fully fulfill this. And I think it's interesting, this word wonderful. So you can obviously sort of, do something that's like awesome or amazing, or sort of like looking up to it. But if you look at other uses in the Old Testament where the same Hebrew word is used, it actually is more to do with like miracles and miraculous, right? So like in Exodus 15, we read, "Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders?" Or in Isaiah 25, we read, "Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you and praise your name. For in perfect faithfulness you have done wonderful things, things planned long ago." And in Psalms, it's the same word, rather than being translated as wonderful, is translated as miracles. So it's, "I'll remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I remember your miracles of long ago." Right. So some translations would say, "I'll remember your wonders of long ago." And so yeah, I really think that this sort of title here is meant to remind us that like the coming Messiah is like the same God who did these miracles in the Old Testament, right? It's the same God who parted the Red Sea, and so we should expect like the counsel coming from the Messiah to be like miraculous, right? If you follow in His wisdom, if you follow in His guidance, you should see like truly remarkable, like supernatural, astounding things happening in your life. And so while Hezekiah was a good king at the time, he wasn't like he didn't achieve all this, right? This is all achieved in Jesus. And hopefully, if we're following Jesus, we're seeing these miraculous things happening in our lives when we're following his wise counsel. Um, so the next title is this of Mighty God, and you might read that and say, well, how could anyone think that this refers to Hezekiah? But so interestingly, it's sort of like play on words almost in the Hebrew, right? So mighty can also sort of mean strength, and Hezekiah, the name literally means like Yahweh strengthens, or Yahweh is my strength, right? Like it's Hezekiah. That Yah at the end is the same as the first syllable in Yahweh. So some people say that, oh well, this was actually referring to Hezekiah, right? Because it's his name means strong, and so it's this sort of like idea of being like a mighty God. It's sort of referring to him. But interestingly, it's actually a different word that's mighty here in Isaiah. It's not just like strong in the like muscular sense, but it's strong in the sense of like a hero or someone that conquers or overcomes or a warrior. And so like other uses of the same word in like Judges, we read Jephthah the Gideonite was a mighty warrior. Or in 1 Samuel 14, all the days of Saul there was a bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. And so yeah, it's more than just like being strong. It's about like being heroic and conquering and overcoming. And in some ways, we see that Hezekiah didn't really live up to that, right? He sort of protected Jerusalem, but he didn't like conquer the whole of the Assyrian Empire. He didn't push them out of the north of Israel. So it's really Jesus that comes and then fulfills this of being someone that conquers something, right? Because Jesus comes and he conquers death. How much more impressive is that than just Hezekiah, who, yes, he relies on God's strength and that protects Jerusalem, but Jesus comes and like takes it to the next level, right, by conquering death itself. And yeah, it's also maybe worth pointing out that this like the phrase "mighty God," like when those two words are used together, elsewhere in the Old Testament, it's only ever used like for like Yahweh, right? For like the Lord God, and so it's also sort of equating Jesus to God, right? It's saying like, yeah, this coming Messiah isn't just like some great man. It's like, no, he is actually mighty God as well. So it's sort of equating the two in that sense. And as we know, Jesus then goes on in the Gospels to say that he claims to be God, and obviously that upsets the Pharisees quite a lot. But yeah, it's this sort of bringing the two together, right? Of like, yes, it's the same thing. And so the next name in the passage is this of everlasting Father, and I think this is one that's quite challenging, right? Because it's like, well, okay, well, why is Jesus here being called the Father? And some people say, well, maybe it isn't Jesus being called the Father. Maybe this is still referring to God, or this name isn't being given to Jesus, and maybe it's just sort of following on the idea from mighty God, that they're sort of equivalent, but different. And other people say, oh well, maybe it's disproving the Trinity. And so there's all these sort of different like theories and people that grapple with this. And so I'm not sure I can claim to have the complete answer here, but I want to give you a few alternatives, and then maybe we can discuss them after the talk. So the first thing that I've seen people say is that to call Jesus the everlasting Father is like a reflection of Jesus's characteristics, right? So if we look at what sort of characteristics would be expected of a father in the Bible, it's someone who's wise, who's respected, who's powerful. The father was always seen as like the head of the household, or like a leader, right? And so Jesus is like that to the church, effectively. The father is expected to teach their children, and Jesus was obviously a great teacher. And so, yeah, we see that that Jesus sort of fulfills the characteristics of Father, and following on our sort of looking at like Hezekiah as well, we can see that Hezekiah to some extent like fulfilled these characteristics as well, right? So I think maybe that's one valid way of looking at it. I think another way that of looking at it is I've read that everlasting Father can also be translated as Father of eternity, which is quite a different meaning, right? It's sort of then not the name of God the Father. Jesus is like the Father of eternity. He's like the creator of eternity. He's somehow made eternity, right? And we see that picked up quite a lot in the Bible of So, like for example, in John 1, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of truth and grace." So we can see here in this picture, it's like without Jesus, nothing would have been made that has been made, right? And so it's like, and if you said, without the Father of eternity, like nothing would have been made. So I think maybe that's sort of following on from that idea. Um, Colossians then goes even further and says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He was before all things, and in him all things hold together." So again, this sort of interesting picture of like it wasn't just Jesus was like vital to creating eternity, but also that like without Jesus it all falls apart, right? It doesn't hold together. Um, so again, I think maybe that's this idea of like without the father or the head of a household, that household like falls apart. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the sort of correct answer is, and it'd be great to hear people's thoughts on this, and maybe it's some combination of all of these, because it is interesting how this name of like everlasting father, you think of God the Father, so why is it being used for Jesus here? Um, yeah, finally, the final name that's given to Jesus here is this idea of Prince of Peace as well. And so again, looking at Hezekiah, we can see that like why he might be considered the Prince of Peace, right? So he, if you read his story, he first attempted diplomacy with the king of Assyria, and then when that failed, he trusted in God, and that maintained the peace in Jerusalem. So yeah, you can see why people would say, he was this one that brought peace to the nation, but ultimately that peace was temporary, right? So in 2 Kings 20, we read that Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good," Hezekiah replied, for he thought, "Will there not be peace and security in my lifetime?" And so yeah, it was true that there was relative peace in Hezekiah's lifetime, right? But it fails later on, right? Jerusalem is later conquered. Um, but Jesus, on the other hand, brings like this supernatural peace, right? That's like completely different to anything that the earth will experience or can offer. And so there's a couple of verses here that sort of highlight this idea. So in John 14, we read, this is Jesus's words that "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." And then in John 16, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." So yeah, it's like the Prince of Peace is like so much more than just what Hezekiah could have brought, right? It's bringing this peace that is completely overcoming the world, right? And so we see that in the way that Jesus conquered death, and brought so where he said previously with that idea of like mighty God and conquering this idea that he's conquered death, and through that he brings about this supernatural peace. But also, interestingly, with peace, is that in Hebrew, the word for peace is shalom, which can also mean whole or wholeness. Um, so, as an example of that, in Job 5, we read this verse: "You will know that your tent is secure. You will take stock of your property and find nothing missing." But the King James version translates that verse as, "Thou shalt know that thy tabernacle shall be in peace, and thou shalt visit thy habitation, and thou shalt not sin." So this phrase that there was nothing missing from his tent is translated as his tent's in peace, in another translation, right? And I think not only is Jesus like the Prince of Peace, it's like, well, what does that look like? What does that mean? Well, I think Jesus is also the Prince of like wholeness, right, and of like full reconciliation. And it's only through knowing Jesus and knowing God that we can be fully reconciled with God the Father, right? Him dying on the cross made that bridge that means we can have relationship with God. Um, so yeah, I think it's again this picture of like Jesus goes so much further than the like human peace brought by Hezekiah, that he's making this wholeness, which is and this peace which is only possible because of Jesus and through Jesus. Um, so yeah, I think I'm sort of wrapping up now, and I think as a sort of I guess final encouragement, the early Christians like certainly saw Jesus as a fulfillment of this passage, right? So in Matthew 4 we read, when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah, land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Um, so yeah, certainly the early, the writers of the Gospels saw Jesus as being a fulfillment of this, and so yeah, as we sort of finish Sanctuary for the year and move into this time of Christmas, I think it just be great for us all to find time to reflect on this, to reflect on those names that we've read about today that Jesus has been given, that Jesus the role that Jesus has, and as we have Christmas, just to reflect on that and remember the true meaning of that. Um, so yeah, we'll move into a time of discussion now, and we can go in whatever direction people feel is best. But a few sort of ideas of things we could talk about. The first is just if anything stood out to you or anything was sort of in a new light from the passage we read today. We could sort of look at each of the four names that are given, and sort of how you understand the meanings of those and what they mean. And then finally, it'd be, as this is the last session, we could also look at how are we going to remember Jesus' role over this Christmas period this year.